name is Shirley Rodriguez. I'm a project coordinator and I work at the Public Health Institute of Western Mass. And one of the initiatives that I work with is on the Springfield Healthy Homes Collaborative, who in partnership with Revitalize CDC have sponsored this webinar series on making homes healthier. And we are so glad to have you all with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and hand the reins to David Turcotte from UMass Lowell, so he can present himself and share with you all the interesting things that he has to share on keeping your home healthy.
Thank you, Shirley. I'm pleased to be here today with everyone in this webinar. As Shirley says, I'm David Turcotte. I'm a research professor at UMass Lowell. I also direct the Healthy Homes program and the New England Healthy Homes Training Center, which is affiliated with the National Healthy Homes Training Center and Network, which is supported by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So what I'm going to be presenting today are two additional principles out of the principles of healthy homes. First one will be keep it ventilated, and then in the second part of the presentation will be keep it safe. So the reason it's important to keep it well ventilated is that, you know, pollutants can accumulate within the home. Sometimes they're anywhere between 2 to 5 times higher than what we find outdoors. And what we're going to do now is bring up a polling question. So what is the most common hazard seen in the home that you have visited that good ventilation will reduce? So please select the one that you have seen or heard of that could be improved and reduced by ventilation. Ten more seconds. So it looks like that the most common, well, mold and moisture are obviously related. So yeah, those were the most common that people have seen. So these are, you know, the kinds of hazards that can be reduced by ventilation, proper ventilation with, you know, the situation now with coronavirus. I mean, that's another area you probably heard a lot about, particularly in the workplace and in schools, where proper ventilation can help reduce that hazard. Types of things that, you know, need to be ventilated, you know, sources of combustion contaminants or ovens, particularly when they're being used as heaters, because they're not designed for that. Spillage or leaking from the furnace or hot water heaters, fireplace, any kind of heaters or fireplaces that are ventless, as well as if you have an attached garage, the car exhaust is something that you know, is a source of combustion contaminants that you need to be aware of. So as we've talked about, when when you're exposed to carbon monoxide, which is one of the byproducts of combustion, you can get headaches, dizziness, confusion. It can kill you, as I'm sure you know. Another byproduct is something called nitrogen dioxide, which can cause a lot of nose and throat irritation, shortness of breath. When you're exposed to nitrogen dioxide, it also raises the risk of developing a respiratory disease like asthma, as well as it can exacerbate an asthma condition, make it worse. These are various standards that exist out there. And the EPA says that, for example, outdoor ambient air shouldn't be, for a 1 hour period, shouldn't be more than 35 parts per million of carbon monoxide. But the carbon monoxide alarms that we put in our homes, they're established by the Consumer Product Safety Commission and tested by underwriters, laboratories, and they won't even go off until we're at 70 parts per million over a 1 to 4 hour period. And in Canada, they have a standard where that they don't want it to be more than 25 parts per million for 1 hour of duration. And the same thing for the World Health Organization. So what this tells you is the carbon monoxide alarm is important and you should have it in your home and it can save your life, but it doesn't go off until the levels of carbon monoxide are very high, higher than what these other standards recommend. So this is, again, a typical carbon monoxide alarm. When you place it, which is required by the Housing Sanitary Code in Massachusetts, you want to have it near a sleeping area. You want to have it on every level of the home that is occupied. And you have to be careful where you place it. If it's too close to some appliances, it may go off prematurely. A lot of people, die of carbon monoxide death every year, plus another 15,000 non-fire related healthcare visits per year because of carbon monoxide exposure. So it's an important contaminant to address. And good ventilation can also help reduce illnesses such as common colds, influenza, pneumonia, bronchitis. And it's been shown to decrease the rate of absenteeism in schools for students in the workplace. So when we're talking about ventilation, there's really 3 types of ventilation. There's local exhaust ventilation, which removes the contaminants at the source of where they're being generated. And then whole house ventilation is where we bring in a supply of fresh air to reduce contaminants by what we call dilution. And then you can control the airflow in the building to ensure that there's not an imbalance of airflow that could carry contaminants from the outside into the home or from another source within the home. So when you're thinking about ventilation, you really need to understand some key concepts in regards to air. So this is key to understand is any portion of the air that leaves the house, a same amount is going to come in from somewhere. And air is like water, usually seeks the path of least resistance. When you heat air, it rises. When you cool it, it sinks. And again, air can be hot, cold, wet, dry, polluted when it enters or exits the home. So the key thing you want to remember is when it is exiting the home and fresh air is coming in from somewhere to replace it, you want it to be not a contaminated source coming into the home. So for powering airflow, temperature differentials, as I mentioned, can move air. Fans, mechanical ventilation can move air. And then the wind can move air also within a building. But typical homes, were not planned to have a fresh air supply. I mean, the newer large multifamily structures can be, but most homes, in existence in Massachusetts were not planned to have a supply of fresh air. So we really depend on our fresh air from leakages around the windows, doors, cracks, and often they're not adequate. This shows you kind of different places where you need some form of air flow. You want to exhaust the kitchen and bathroom. Contaminants are generated there, moisture, chimney from combustion gases. You'd clothes dry, you'd want to exhaust. And then you could have a fresh air inlet or outlet within the home. You could also have, intakes and exhausts for ventilation. But as I mentioned, most homes today don't have those. So this is showing you kind of a large multifamily complex. So in the left-hand diagram, it talks about typical airflow. The problem with the traditional multifamily structure is pretty much air just flows into the building. It flows from the lower floors to the upper floors. So any kind of odors or pollutants from the upper floors will move up to the from the lower floors will move to the upper floors. And so if there's any kind of tobacco smoke or other indoor air quality issues, it's going to move from lower level to the upper level. As you can see in the photo in the middle, you have a lot of windows open at the top of this building. It's because, as we mentioned, when air is heated, it rises. So the hot air is rising up to the top, and people are too warm up in the top floor. So they're opening the windows to let some of it out. But that just pulls in more cooled air from the basement and it moves it up into the various floors. A better system is where each unit will have its own intake of individual air and will exhaust its own air to the outside. You won't have the movement of air from the lower levels up to the higher levels. The air will be less contaminated because you're not bringing up any kind of contaminants from the lower levels up to the upper levels. So that's the best type of design. So some of the newer buildings are being designed this way. So, so if you're in a home doing an inspection, these are the kinds of things and areas you want to check. You want to make sure the exhaust fans are working and the dryers and the bathroom and so forth. You want to make sure the gas stove isn't being used as a heater. You want to make sure the windows do open so people need to get ventilation and fresh air. You want to make sure all the alarms are functional. You want to make sure people aren't using unvented gas or kerosene heaters, which could kill residents, make them sick. You want to make sure the hot water heaters are venting correctly. You want to make sure all of the furnaces, boilers, fireplaces are vented. You want to make sure there's no rooms without a window. If you smelling, lingering odors, that's a sign that there's a problem with ventilation. Same thing with stale air. Windows fogging up means there's an excess of moisture in the building, which is a problem. And again, these are all the things that should be ventilated. Many of them we've already talked about. It's key that all of these things are vented. How do you know if the exhaust fans are working? This is an example of a fan in a bathroom. We call it the shaman method because if you don't have any way of testing it, you can put a piece of toilet paper up against it. And if it sticks, the chances are that it's working okay. If it doesn't stick, then you got a problem and the fan needs to be repaired, or it could be clogged because it hasn't been changed. On the left, you want to make sure that we call the damper, which is the door that on the outside of the building, isn't taped or isn't stuck. This is an example on the photo on the left of actually the damper was taped and the tape was never taken off when it was installed. So it wasn't able to exhaust the air out correctly. The other thing is you want to have the duct work as straight as possible because that's the way it functions the best. This is a bad duct tubing here because it moves up and down. It's not straight and it's going to affect the flow and the functioning of it. So some of the things you want to try to vent out is you want to vent out moisture, odors, grease. If you're cooking with a gas stove, it would be good to to vent out the byproducts from cooking with gas. So you may have excessive moisture when you're cooking soups or stews. excuse me, you've got carbon monoxide that's being generated, nitrogen dioxide. The other thing that gets generated from cooking with gas stoves is particulate matter. That can irritate someone's lungs and respiratory condition, as well as worsen an asthma condition. So all these things are important to try to vent to the outside. And, usually you want to have fans that are quiet, that are part of the ventilation system, because if it's too noisy, people are going to try to disable it or not use it. If you're unable to exhaust things from the kitchen because you don't have that ability, opening windows would help. If you happen to have an air purifier with a HEPA filter, that's another thing that could help remove these contaminants. On the left-hand photo here is showing you that there's an exhaust fan above this stove in range. As you can see with the cabinets open, that's the vent that exhausts out to the outside. On the right-hand side, you can't see it because the closet is closed, doors are closed, but in reality, this is not venting to the outside. All it is a circulating fan. That will help a little. You can use it, but it doesn't remove the contaminants to the outside. It just helps disperse them a little bit. And here's an example of an exhaust outlet that's clogged, that needs to be cleaned. So these things need to be maintained. So if you're out in a home doing some kind of inspection, these are things you want to look at. You want to make sure it's for a dryer, that it's, that it's venting correctly and there's nothing blocking it. This is a technician who's using some kind of chemical smoke to ensure that the hot water heater is exhausting the combustion gases correctly, the carbon monoxide correctly, because this could kill residents or injure them. Another thing that's important, and I know many people aren't able to get into the basements and aren't able to see these things, but if you are, you want to make sure that there's a filter in forced hot air system, and you want to make sure it's sealed well, because if it's like this, it's not going to be filtering well. And those contaminants are going to get around the home and be circulated. And you want to look at the efficiency standard for the replacement filters for forced hot air systems. MERV is probably the most common. Generally, it's recommended you at least have an 8. The higher the number, the more efficient it is in removing things from the environment, removing particles and contaminants. This shows you kind of based on the rating what kind of contaminants are being removed. Now, but looking at this, you would say, well, the best thing to do would be to put in a MERV rated filter from 17 to 20, which in theory is correct. But however, most systems cannot function with a filter that's fine, because it will be inadequate airflow. So you really have to see what the system can handle and what the recommendations are for the type of system, HVAC system, furnace, central air system that might be in the home. But generally, 8 will work in pretty much all of the systems today. This is, some other systems in regards to, as I mentioned, the HEPA air filter is very efficient in removing contaminants from the environment. The American Lung Association has a health standard, and then this is another performance rating. This is an example of a filter that goes in for hot air furnace, but this filter is not very good. I would not recommend it. It's less than 4 on the MERV scale, so it doesn't really collect a lot of things. So this is something that's inexpensive, but I would not recommend. It's not effective at all. So the key messages are in regards to ventilation is that it's important to maintain health. It's necessary to remove humidity and dilute or remove contaminants. And then again, if you've got a local exhaust ventilation, it removes the contaminants at the source where they're created. And while your whole house ventilation will bring in outside fresh air to dilute the contaminant level within the home. So now we're going to move in to keep it safe. So one thing to think about is what's the difference between an injury and an accident? From our perspective, you know, an accident is something that happens by chance, you know, but an injury is something you can prevent. So that's what we're going to focus on today, is talking about what contributes to injuries, what causes injuries, and how to prevent them. So these are examples of things that could result in injury, you know, holes in the floor that people could trip on, or, you know, problems with the electrical wire, lack of alarms that would warn people if the environment was becoming unsafe. So our next poll question will ask, what is the most common cause of home injury deaths? You know, choking and suffocation, drowning, falls, firearms, fires and burns, or poisoning. Shirley, if you could launch the poll, please. A few more seconds. Last chance to vote. So these are results. I think people are very knowledgeable of what causes home injury death, because falls is number one, and that, as you'll see in the next slide, is the most common. So as the data shows, you know, 43% of the home injury deaths are caused by falls, closely followed by poisoning, and then fires and burns, choking and suffocation, drowning, and firearms. But, you know, the risk of this kind of home injury death varies by age and population. So infants are at the highest risk of injury death, and young children up until 14 for non-fatal falls in the home. And then fires and burns are the highest rate of home injury death among 1 to 14-year-olds, older adults, you know, non-fatal falls as well as fatal falls are the highest risk category for older adults. If you happen to be 80 years old or greater, then the risk is 20 times higher for death from an injury than someone younger. So it's important to understand, you know, what the risks are by the various ages and populations, and when you're working with individuals and families. Glass safety is important. You don't want, you know, children falling through glass and getting seriously injured, or falling out windows, particularly at high levels of the upper floors. You need to have good grab bars in the bathroom, going up and down stairs, and so forth. You also want to be aware of, you know, where children play and whether there's risk. So obviously, you know, jumping on a trampoline right next to a concrete wall, you know, can certainly cause injury, as well as holes where children could fall into and be seriously injured. Again, debris being left around on the outside of homes or areas where children's play can lead to injuries. Sharp edges and splinters at playgrounds. And you want to be aware of where children are landing on from slides. You don't want them landing on hard surfaces like stones or concrete. And then poisoning is a big problem, as we saw from the earlier slide. But where the risks are really high is because, according to surveys, 82% of households keep medicine in unlocked drawers and cabinets, and 69% of the homes with young children store chemicals in unlocked areas. So having those cabinets secure are important. You can see on the photo on the right that has a cabinet lock that makes it difficult for children to open and access chemicals. These are some other examples, of the lower drawer has a lock on it to keep it away from children for medicine. But then you have a picture on the upper left-hand side here where there's a lot of chemicals, and many of them very dangerous, that could be easily accessed by children. It's important to kind of understand labels. So depending on what the item is, different federal agencies oversee the labeling of products. So, Food and Drug Administration has to do with drugs, food and cosmetics, EPA, pesticides, Consumer Product Safety Commission, a lot of things containing hazardous chemicals, and OSHA, the safety data sheets, which should be SDS now, it used to be MSDS. So this is an example of, a drain opener to unclog drains, but as you can see there's a danger sign on it. So there should be some kind of, something there that indicates the level of risk and danger of the product. And so you want to make sure that labeling is, you look at the labeling before you buy products or store products and use products. So the next polling question, if you could bring it up, which product label is the least hazardous? If a product is labeled with a caution, or with dangerous, or with warning, which product label is the least hazardous? Few more seconds. So caution was what was the top choice for individuals taking the poll. And actually, the warnings go from warning being the least hazardous to caution and then to danger. So again, if you have a choice between those three, you would want to pick products that have warning labels versus caution or versus danger. So danger signals, it's very highly toxic. There's potential for corrosive impact of skin, and it can be extremely flammable. So it's important to, to know the difference between corrosive versus irritant. An irritant, will irritate your skin, but it won't destroy the cells. Something that's corrosive can actually destroy cells in your skin or in your body. So again, something that can be an irritant is safer, less hazardous than something that has the potential of being corrosive. And the other thing to keep in mind is, the difference between flammable and combustible. Flammables will start a fire and combustibles will feed a fire. So again, if you're going to select a product that says flammable and one that says combustible, you'd want to pick the one that says combustible. Something that's flammable, has a very low flash point, which is the temperature where liquid will support a flame. So something that's extremely flammable, has a very low flash point of less than 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So you want to stay away from anything that's flammable. I believe we showed this in the Keep It Pest Free webinar, but again, this is a typical pesticide product label for the EPA. It tells you what the name is, keep out of reach of children. It will give you indications about, whether it has a caution or warning label, or whether it's even more serious, dangerous, where, it could be, have more extreme impacts. What to do in case it's ingested or gets on people's skin. There should be information about first aid. And if it's really poisoned, then, may have likely should have a skull and crossbone. And you want to make sure anything that's hazardous is labeled well. You don't want to be mixing things and putting them in bottles. This is something you don't want to do. It looks like, it's in a milk or juice bottle. And for folks who don't read Spanish, the bottle on the right says mata moscas, which means kills flies. So obviously you wouldn't want a child drinking that. And again, these kinds of chemicals should not be stored anywhere where children can reach them. They need to be secure. Unfortunately, in arts and craft products, you need to be aware of what the content is. There's been arts and craft projects, paints that have had lead content in them, even though you can't use lead paint in residential buildings, but some of the arts and craft material have been found to have lead paint in them. Fires and burns, obviously house fires can lead to serious consequences. You have to be aware of the potential of scalding with high hot water temperatures. Just to give you an example, home fires from smoking, usually almost 8,000 of those are created a year. It's the leading cause of civilian fire deaths. And most of them, 2/3 of it is caused by abandoned or discarded smoking material. Usually the bedroom is the leading area where fires originate from. And interesting, the fires mostly occur between noontime and 8 p.m., which can be surprising because you would think it might be late at night when someone's smoking in their bed, but that's what the data indicates. And you want to make sure you have operating smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. We recommend having a fire extinguisher in the kitchen. And this shows you just, how quickly a child can be scalding, have scalding based on, touching hot water. So if the water temperature is, say, 133 degrees, the hot water, it would take about 15 seconds of exposure for scalding. But if the water temperature is over 155 degrees, it can happen instantaneously, like within 1 second. So it's important not to have the temperature in the hot water heater too high. You also have to be concerned about choking. So if children are playing, at the playground or playing with anything, you want to make sure it's not a risk of choking. On the left-hand photo here, it shows you kind of a cord with a loop, which is, something that has contributed and has caused children to die from choking. This is an example on the right of an electric shock hazard. You don't want children sticking things in there, getting electric shock or sticking their little fingers in there. So those should be covered if they're not being used, if there's children around. Again, drowning, is a serious hazard for young children. So you want to make sure the swimming pools are secure, but also children can drown in small quantities of water. So the photo on the right is showing a bucket full of water where, unfortunately, some young children have actually died in a bucket of water. Firearms is another area that you have to take caution with. Any kind of firearm should be secured and they should be locked. And you want to be storing ammunition separate from weapons. And many years ago, I'm surprised I survived my childhood, but my father had a hunting rifle and I found out where it was. He used to hide it in the corner of a closet. And I got in there and took out his hunting rifle and started playing with it. Fortunately, he didn't have any ammunition in it, and he didn't have any ammunition around. So, before my mother noticed that I had it, she, took it away from me, and unfortunately, nothing happened. But if there was, ammunition nearby, or if there was, ammunition in the gun, I could have shot, myself. I could have shot one of my family members by accident. So it's important to secure any kind of firearms. So the key messages are that injuries, again, are not accidents. An injury can be prevented. And as I mentioned, there's many potential risks of injury can be found in the home, but you can minimize injuries and you can prevent them by taking the right action. And again, there's many ways, I covered several of them in this presentation to prevent injuries, minimize the chance of injuries. And again, generally the highest risk populations are young children and older adults to injuries in the home. And as we've talked about, falls is the most common cause of injury death in the homes, followed by poison, fire, burns, the most common ones that lead to injury deaths. So at this point, I'd like to, it's my contact information. I'd like to open it up to questions.
So feel free, if you have any questions, feel free to chat them in the, put them in the chat, and I will read them off to Dave. Looks like this is a quiet group, Dave.
Is there a way of opening it up for questions verbally?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we do that? Maybe people would rather ask verbal questions.
Yeah, I can't put my hand up. I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to know, I had some homes inspected recently, and the hot water heater was like in a closet on the side of the bathroom. I don't remember any inspector saying that they had to be vented. Can you talk more about that? About hot water heaters being vented, please. Thank you.
Yes. I'm assuming, is it a natural gas hot water heater?
No, I think it's electric.
Oh, electric. Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, natural gas hot water heaters have to be vented because, the combustion gas, carbon monoxide, can kill you. But electric hot water heater, I mean, I'm not sure if it needs to be vented, to be honest with you, because is it generating any kind of contaminants or combustion by heating, because, heating the hot water. That would be my question. I'm not, if it is generating something, then, it should be heated if it's in an area that, a small closet, where it's, it gets in contact with materials or things that could be heated, then that would not be safe, and you wouldn't want to, have it in a place like that.
Well, there's a washer dryer and then
Right.
the hot water heater. And
Okay,
because I had a few homes inspected, I don't remember any inspector mentioning that they had to be vented. So
yeah, no, to
I
my
guess I'll
knowledge,
ask the inspector.
that's not a requirement for an electric hot water heater. But if it's an electric dryer, it still should be vented because the electric dryers create a lot of moisture, excess moisture and excess lint, which can, cause health problems and lead to mold and, generate a lot of things that could exacerbate an asthma condition, right, from the lint and so forth. And mold growing on the lint.
The dryer does have a vent. I mean,
Yes,
the washer dryer does have a vent.
yeah.
I just don't remember the heater being hooked
Yeah,
up.
no, I don't think, to my knowledge, I mean, to be honest with you, every home I've ever been in has had a hot water heater. It's powered by gas, natural gas. So I can't recall seeing, any in particular, but yeah, I don't see that would be a requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
I'll wait for other questions and then I have another one.
Oh, okay, great. Other questions? Well, Abigail, why don't you go ahead?
It's me again. In the kitchen, you said there should be a fire extinguisher. Am I responsible as a landlord to put that there, or do the tenants need to put that there?
Yeah, you are not required, to my knowledge, according to the code, to have a fire extinguisher. But it's
And the same question for the child safety locks. My buildings have children, so it's up to the tenants to install the child safety locks.
correct.
Thank you.
Right, but the thing about the locks are, sometimes there's two types of locks. You can, locks that you have to like drill in and attach, to the wooden cabinets, or whatever kind of cabinets they are. And sometimes landlords don't want that. So there are other locks, if they have knobs, you can fasten on in the outside of the cabinet along the knobs, and the tenant can take those with them to the next apartment also. So when we've worked with families with young children and we've given them, safety devices as part of our interventions, we've usually given them the ones that are portable, the ones that they can take with them if they move to another apartment. And it doesn't, and permission from the landlord is not required.
So these are available somewhere for people to get?
Oh, yes. They are available at places like Home Depot and hardware stores will have those type of devices. You can get knobs for the stoves, to prevent children from turning on the stoves and burning themselves. You can get knobs for the outside doors to make it difficult for children to open the doors and go out of the building and the apartments. You can, get locks, for the cabinets. You can get the plugs for the outlets. Those things are common. You're usually able to find.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Still a lot of people on. You still have more than 10 minutes. If you have questions, feel free to ask them.
So somebody did post a question, and I'll read it to you, Dave. As a
Okay.
weatherization auditor, it's been really tricky tightening up homes with combustibles. The heating systems aren't direct vented and they spill during worst case scenario. CAZ test. Other folks having this issue?
Okay, could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I missed a little bit at the beginning.
As a weatherization.
Oh, I can actually see the question. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, well, that's a problem. I mean, it's definitely a problem when this is something you gotta, you probably are aware of, hopefully, as a weatherization auditor, is that, it's good to have homes that are weatherized, but you have to make sure, that there's adequate venting and adequate ventilation. I had a situation in my own home, where I had ceiling work done in my basement, from Mass Save and excess insulation put in the attic and attic ceiling in the attic. And then I used to test for radon gases on a regular basis, but after I had the ceiling done in the basement, my radon levels exceeded the action levels. So I ended up having to get a radon mitigation system installed. Since that's been installed, it's very low now. But so yeah, this is something you got to be aware of. If you're tightening up homes, you got to be sure there's adequate ventilation and you're not creating an indoor air quality problem as a result of that work. And it's something that others have had issues with. I don't know if anyone else on the webinar has had an issue, but it's something you want to be careful of. Yeah, someone said you can find the safety items at Walmart and Target also. Other questions?
David, I have another question, please.
Yes.
One of the homes that I looked at had mold in the attic on both sides, and the seller hired a mold remediation unit to remove the mold. But one of the things that came up was that it probably wasn't vented properly. So if I want to address that, who am I going to hire? I'm not going to hire a contractor. What kind of person would I hire to look at the attics and make sure that they're well vented?
Well, I mean, a heating and air conditioned person should, know what is appropriate.
Really? Okay.
So that might be one. But there's also, consultants and contractors out there that specialize in mold remediation and because mold is a byproduct of excessive moisture. So, I mean, it can happen, when you have inadequate ventilation, if you have a lot of moisture building up, which sounds like what happened exactly in your attic. So, but contractors, should know what kind of, ventilation they need in the attic. I mean, you can install, some kind of mechanical ventilation, for your attic also to increase your, your ventilation. Airflow. Most attics don't do that. They have kind of spaces on each side of the home. I'm talking about like a single family or a small, 2 or 3 family. But in the case of, how many units was in this home you were talking about?
It only has 2 units.
Okay.
So I will, I'll I had a contractor come out. Unfortunately, he was there 20 minutes and charged me $200. So
yeah, well, that's
but I had another issue in another building where the inspector said that there were 2 types of ventilation installed, and which I found confusing, but I guess for that, I'll try to hire an HVAC company to see if they can help me out.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing about, attic mold growth is you've got to make sure if you have like bathroom, exhaust fans for the bathrooms, you don't want to be venting them into the attic because that will likely lead to mold, because you're venting warm, moist air from the attic. Those should be vented directly outside.
And they should be checked once a year, right? I mean, someone should go up there.
Yeah,
and check
and
them
it could
once a year.
also be a question of, inadequate insulation, like if you have a recessed light on the ceiling of the bathroom up in, in the floor just below the attic, if it's warm, moist air can get into the attic from around the recessed light also. I'm not saying that's the case, but I don't know. But that's been known to happen too. But good ventilation, good insulation in the attic will also help prevent ice damming, which, can cause structural problems to the roof and lead to, moisture and rain getting in and leading to mold growth also. You really want the attic temperature to be close as possible to the outdoor temperature.
The attic temperature should match the outdoor temperature, winter, summer, spring, and fall.
As close as you possible. I mean, if you have bad insulation, if you have bad ventilation in your attic in the summer, it's going to be extremely hot in your attic. But it will be hotter than what the outdoor temperature is. And in the winter, you may be warmer, warmer in your attic than the outdoor temperature. So you want it to be as close as possible.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Dave, I noticed there is another question in the chat, and it's regarding lead.
Yes. Well, the children should be tested, regularly for for their lead levels. Their blood lead levels to be checked, so to see that they're not being exposed to lead dust, and so they'll ensure that they're not elevated. That would be one thing that they should do. The other thing would be if they, if they suspect, if they're in a building that's older than 1978, the likelihood of lead in the paint is high. So, the family should see if there's a local lead abatement program or lead program that the city runs or some other entity within the community. And often they will provide testing as well as inspections. So that would be the other thing, if they could get someone to come in from a lead program, if there is a lead program in the community to do an inspection, I would recommend that. Can tenants do what? Can tenants test it for their own lead in the paint, you mean? Or can tenants contact a local lead program? Tenants can contact a lead program, but to do any kind of lead abatement, or depending on the type of testing, the landlord might have to be involved, but certainly they can have their children tested, and a lead program would be willing to, to test if there's a concern. But any kind of abatement would have to be the landlord, would have to be involved. And any other questions? We still have a few minutes if anyone has anything.
So Dave, as we're waiting for others to maybe chime in with their questions, do you want to let folks know what our last webinar will be next Thursday?
Yes, the last webinar will focus on keep it maintained and keep it contaminant free. Those will be the two principles of healthy homes that we will be focusing on next Thursday.
And yes, any of our recordings, the recordings will be on our Healthy Homes website. I shared that link up in the chat, but let me just go ahead and paste that the link to the page one more time for you here. And at that page, you'll also be able to find the slides that David shared. All right, so if there's no further questions, I think we will end the recording now. And I appreciate you all